Okay, so today I wanted to talk a little bit about the blood scandal and how that links into the legacy of cover-up in British society over the last couple of 100 years. And I'm going to link that in to the education of our elites, those who are in positions of power, and in particularly boarding school. Okay. So, as most of you will have heard, in Britain at the moment, we have this blood scandal, which is essentially in the 60s and 70s, 80s. There was blood which was contaminated, which was given to patients. And in particular, this came to my, into my realm because there was in particular a boarding school which was set up for people with blood issues, and essentially they were used as experiments there, and I think of the 120 pupils, about 30 of them survived that time. So it's just some things present. So today I want to talk a little bit about that. What is this legacy of cover-up, and what happens with that? So thank you. So I've been reading. I've got this book here, Legacy of Violence by Caroline Elkins. And if you can see, it's quite a big book. And it's the history of the British Empire. And it's really talking about, what often we do not talk about in Britain is the violence, the bad things we did. Yes, we did some good things with the British Empire. There's no doubt within that. But the shadow side, and Caroline talks about this, and it's on the back. She says, that basically the Searing Landmark study draws on more than a decade of research on 4 continents to reveal the dark heart of Britain's empire, racialized, systematized doctrine of unrelenting violence, which it used to secure and maintain its interests across the globe. When Britain could no longer maintain control over that violence, it simply retreated and sought to destroy the evidence. So what we're seeing now, if we look at it on a trauma lens, this is this intergenerational trauma. She talks about in here, this book, there's some horrific stories of, what some of the things we've done Britain. One of them was talking about India. I think this was about 1890s, possibly mid 1850s. The Indians had defeated the British in a battle, and the British, their pride was very hurt. And where these people who had been fighting were from, the Britain went in and they just razed the whole valley, all of the villages, all of the houses, everything, all the land. And at the end, the viceroy said, "Oh well, we've got revenge. That's it." And I see that we don't hear about these stories. We don't hear about these things. And if you look at the blood scandal, this is, in the last few years we've had lots. We've had the post office scandal, the post office inquiry, basically people who were ostracized and put in prison. It was a computer fault, but basically they put it onto the workers. You've got Grenfell Tower, you've got Windrush as well, which is where people who had come in as immigrants in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and had been invited by the British government, the Home Office had lost their paperwork, and then they tried to extradite them, to send them away. And there's also things like Hillsborough. And we cover up. Now, if we look at this from a psychological perspective, often in the UK, we have this idea that the duty of care in any given situation is always the institution. Second is always the person or people. And I see this in my work with boarding schools, is that it's always the institution which comes first. If there's sexual abuse, is this going to come to light? Is this going to harm the institution? Right, we won't talk about it, we'll hide it. And therefore, I was talking to a headmaster, Tuan Zopperman, in a podcast a couple of years ago, And he says, really, it needs to be swapped around. And he said it needs the children become top. And in these instances of cover-up, it's always the institution, the blood scandal. It's no, if we let that come out to light, it's going to destroy us. But actually, if you leave it in the shadows for 30, 40 years, it's going to come to light, and it's going to, what's happening now? As this is an article from Durham University. It says the infected blood scandal has been hailed the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS. Over 3,000 people have died as a result of receiving contaminated blood products in the 70s, 80s and 90s. And it is estimated that an infected person still dies every 4 days. Every 4 days. Yeah. So the duty of care. And last week I talked about ICSA. And ICSA decided that the duty of care would still stay with the institution. And interestingly, a friend reached out to me, and he works in the financial sector, and he said that actually, if you know that someone is involved in fraud and you don't report it, you can get up to 5 years in prison and an unlimited fine. Okay, but if you see someone being sexually abused, a child, and you don't report it, nothing happens. Whereas many countries across the world, so it's this idea of cover up. What else to talk about? I think there's so many things I could add in. What I'll come into is Nick Duffell's book, Wounded Leaders. And in here, he talks about the 5 reasons that someone who's been to boarding school does not make a good leader. And why this is relevant is so many of the people in British power, 75% of Liz Truss's government, I think Boris Johnson, it was about 60% of his government were ex-boarding school. And, 63% of High Court judges. So these are the people making these rulings. And what he says is that one of the things we learn in these schools is that we learn to cover up. We put a mask on, what he calls the strategic survival personality. And he calls that either the complier, either the rebel, or the crushed. So we put on this personality, and this mask. And so we're covering up. So psychologically, we are covering up. And therefore, when we get older, as I think it's Jung says, psychological rule states that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. So it's like, because we don't deal with that mask, we project it out. So he talks about this idea that all vulnerability is seen as threatening. Consequently, the personality organizes itself in a hyper-defensive way, creating stress but unable to deal with it. Being incapable of admitting mistakes. So this is what we've seen, 60s, 70s, 80s. It's like they've made mistakes, but they've not admitted it. Or making long-term decisions for the common good. Again, this has been shown this last week. In favor of a preponderance of short-term survival-based and self-interest dominated solutions. So this is what this type of education, and I would suggest a lot of British society, because these leaders, this is the way we do things. Well, you don't talk up, you don't speak up, you hide things. And I was going to share some words from George Orwell, and he says, this is Andrew Motion. He says, a complainer was the worst thing a boarder could be. Nobody ever complained because nobody ever listened. Yeah. And this was him talking about boarding school. So that's kind of one of the ideas there, is that, in summary, the short-term survival-based And self-interest dominated solutions are the direct opposite of the qualities that today's leaders need. We need to be vulnerable. We need to be open. We need to be able to see the big picture, and we can't do that. And we also can't connect to our emotions. And Professor Antonio Damasio, in his research, shows, and these are the words of Nick Duffell, he says that we cannot make good decisions without emotional information. And this is one of the things that these leaders learn, that I learned at boarding school, is to squash our feelings down and our emotions. We cannot make good decisions. And again, Grenfell, the blood scandal, the post office, these are things that we do. We make bad decisions. And there was also another point here. He talks about the third reason that boarders don't make good leaders. He says, neuroscientists have demonstrated that the ability to conceive the world from a purely left brain hemisphere bias presents a person with a conceptual world in which people may easily be treated as if they were objects, and wider contexts are ignored in favor of compartmentalized thinking. It is precisely this kind of thinking that the boarding public school boys is encouraged to learn in his secretive, self-reliant world. This way of seeing the world limits perspective and tends towards them and us context, and makes authentic relationships very difficult. Yeah. So I think this is it. We learn in these schools to cover up, and therefore, when we come out and we're in work, so many people have been to boarding schools, the head of the BBC, boarding school, head of Channel 4, boarding school, head of MI6, the head of the Church of England. They're all boarding school. They've all learnt this pattern. And therefore, we're surrounded with people who are covering up. We're surrounded by people who are doing that within their psyche. And therefore, this is what is going to be natural. So I feel that over the last 20, 30 years, there's probably lots more cover up. I've heard quite a few people say, the COVID, the lockdowns, there were lots of cover-ups around that time. So I feel 20, 30 years, we're going to have the same thing. So I think what I see moving forward is we need to come into vulnerability. We need to start being honest. Yeah, I messed up. Do that immediately. It's like it's not that we're not going to make mistakes. We all make mistakes, but we need to go, actually, yeah, I'm vulnerable. I'm messed up there. I and actually we see someone who does that as strong, rather than the person go, I'm fine, everything's all right. I've got on my trauma healing model here. The first stage is dissociation, denial. Oh, it's fine. No, actually, it's not fine. And that's okay, but we need to speak about this. We need to talk about, the history of what we've done. Not to shame us or to blame us, but to bring it to light so we can heal. We've got to heal. And I'll finish on this quote. This is from Jung's work. He says, the unconscious is not a demoniacal monster, but a natural entity which, as far as moral sense, aesthetic taste, and intellectual judgment goes, is completely neutral. It only becomes dangerous when our conscious attitude to it is hopelessly wrong. To the degree that we repress it, its danger increases. So I see this is what we've done in British society. We've repressed this part, and actually it's important. Okay, I've got to start making up, admitting mistakes. I've got to start being honest. I've got to start putting the importance in any institution, in any kind of government, people first, not institutions first. So yeah, I think I could probably talk about this for another 10 days. But yeah, just some ideas around the blood scandal. Hope this makes sense. Any questions, please do let me know. Please put a thumbs up or share this. That would appreciate it. So thank you so much. And yeah, on Friday I've got a podcast going live with a specialist in trauma and physical pain, and just him sharing his journey. So that's very interesting. So thank you so much. Okay, take care.